I want to discuss today 4 types of histories. Often students who study counseling psychology get confused with what is intake history, what is case history, what is case history in MSc, or whether MSc is part of case history or it is a separate thing independent of case history. So let me just begin with what is intake history. Intake history refers to the basic information like demographic details, presenting problem, brief history of the presenting problem, contact details like address, telephone number, etc. collected during the first contact of the counselor with the client. So time spent in collecting this basic information is known as intake history interview or intake history session. This may be compared to what happens if you get admitted or go to a consultation at OPD department in a hospital. When you go to a big hospital, either as an OPD patient or as an inpatient, normally at the registration counter, they ask you to fill up a form which includes your name, your demographic details, your address, your presenting complaint, and the department in which you want to have a consultation, and your address and things like this. So this is actually an intake form that you are filling, and information that you are providing is intake history. So in counseling, this happens during the first meeting of the client and the counselor. Sometimes this may happen even over the phone when the client has contacted the counselor for a session. As soon as a client contacts a counselor for a session, either in person or over the phone, a counselor normally takes some basic information from the client, and this is called intake history. And time spent in collecting intake history is, as I already said, intake history interview or intake history session. Depending on the counselor and the client, this may require about 5, 10, 15 or about 20 minutes of time. Next type of history is case history. Case history is a continuation or extension of case history. After the presenting problem is heard, history of the presenting problem is taken, and using a proper case history format, a detailed history of the client is taken, which is called case history. Case history includes family history, personal history, job history, developmental history, childhood history, education history, health history, marital history, and social history, and such histories. So time spent in gathering case history is called case history interview or case history session. So to do a complete case history, depending on the client, one may need about 1 or 2 or 3 sessions of 50 to 60 minutes duration. So next is technically MSc interview session or MSc history. MSc means mental status examination. So this has a specific form, and there are certain aspects that a counselor needs to observe in the client and note down those observations, and there are other parts where a counselor has to ask certain questions to the client and then record his observations. So time spent in doing mental status examination is called mental status examination history or session, and information gathered during this MSc session is called mental status examination history or MSc history. After doing all this, and also after doing some assessments, if the counselor has a hunch that his or her client may have a diagnosis, he or she may look at DSM-5 or ICD-10 to see if the client meets the criteria of a particular diagnosis. Then, the counselor may check with the client by asking certain questions whether he or she, the client, has these criteria or this psychological disorder. And the time spent in collecting diagnostic history is called diagnostic history interview or diagnostic history session. And information gathered during this time is known as diagnostic history. So during diagnostic history, a counselor will ask the client questions specifically related to a diagnosis to confirm or disconfirm a particular diagnosis. So technically there are 4 types of history: intake history, case history, MS history, and diagnostic history. But in most places, for all practical purposes, everything is called together either as intake history or case history.